What you see here is Hans Island. It's an uninhabited, small island made of nothing but rocks. It's covered in snow and ice most of the year, and it's located in the middle of something called the Nares Strait that runs through Canada and Greenland, an autonomous region of Denmark. So, on the surface, this island doesn't look all that interesting, yet it's responsible for one of the most hilarious and interesting border disputes of all time between two of the friendliest nations, Canada and Denmark. What's so interesting about this island is that while we know exactly where it is, we for some reason don't know who it belongs to. And this is where the friendliest border dispute begins. You see, both Canada and Denmark claim this island as their sovereign territory. And rightfully so, since Hans Island is located smack dab in the middle of the Nares Strait, a 22-mile wide channel, the island therefore falls within the 12-mile territorial limit of either shore, allowing both sides to claim it under international law. This means Canada and Denmark will have to figure out who it belongs to themselves, which they've tried to do on multiple occasions in the past, but without any success. In 1973, for example, Canada and Denmark set out to establish a definitive border through the Nares Strait. So naturally, both countries agreed that the border should run straight through the middle of it. Which is how Franklin and Crozier Island, the only two other islands in the Nares Strait, became part of Greenland, which remember is an autonomous region of Denmark, which was rather easy to agree upon as they were clearly on Greenland's side of the Nares Strait. But for obvious reasons, they couldn't agree on what to do with Hans Island, because of its inconvenient location. That meant the new line went straight through it, so they just left it out of the discussions and put it aside to be resolved later. But while they didn't agree on anything, it didn't stop the two nations from trying to claim it anyway. Although instead of using traditional military practices to conquer the island, they instead used truly unorthodox methods. And by unorthodox methods, I mean probably the most unexpected and unusual approaches to claim land. Let me explain. In 1984, Canadian troops visited the island, not to shoot anyone or put a base there, but simply to plant their nation's flag and, most importantly, leave a bottle of Canadian whiskey. The Danes obviously couldn't let that stand, so the country's Minister of Greenland Affairs soon arrived on the island to replace the offending Canadian symbols with a Danish flag and a bottle of Danish schnapps, along with a note saying, "Velkommen til den danske ø," or "Welcome to the Danish island." And so began the Whiskey War. This war has to be the funniest, friendliest, and most ridiculous border dispute I've ever heard of. And the further you dig into the history and timeline of this border dispute, the more ridiculous it becomes. In 1988, 4 years after the Danes had already put their flag, a note, and a bottle of schnapps on the island, the Danes came back. The Danish Arctic Ocean Patrol arrived at the island and did two things. First, they built a pile of stones, also known as a cairn. And secondly, they placed a flagpole with a Danish flag to further emphasize their symbolic rule over the island. But the Danes weren't done yet, because in 1995 the Danish liaison officer flew in and placed another flagpole and flag, just to be sure the Canadians understood the message. And apparently they did, because in 2002 the Danish inspection ship HMS Velan arrived and saw something quite unusual. The 1988 Danish flag was missing, and the 1995 flag was torn to pieces, which could only have two possible explanations. The first one being two Canadian geologists who had visited the island 1 year prior to this discovery. Their names were Keith Deering and Chris Harrison. They were geologists for the Geological Survey of Canada, and they were on Hans Island to map the northern Ellesmere Island. And since they were the only people apart from the Danes who had visited the island in this time period, they were pretty much the only suspects. But there was a second explanation, which is rough weather, which these flags would have encountered plenty of during the years they were placed there. Considering the Arctic location of the island and the harsh weather conditions they would have had to endure. And since Canadian geologists aren't really the type of people to tear another country's flag to pieces, the weather theory seemed to be the most accurate. So after the Danes had discovered their flags were either gone or torn to pieces, they did what any rational nation in that scenario would do: continue the war by erecting a new cairn, flagpole and flag. Seems like the Danes really wanted this island. It would actually be another 3 years before the Canadians would return to the island in 2005. Maybe they were intimidated or just simply didn't care. Who knows, but what we do know is the things they did once they arrived. They began by placing a traditional Inuit stone marker called an Inuksuk, which is the same as a cairn, so basically a bunch of stones stacked on top of each other. And then obviously they raised the Canadian flag, took the bottle of schnapps the Danes had left there and placed a bottle of Canadian whiskey in its place. All just completely rational things to do. But following this visit, things would quickly escalate, as just 1 week later, the Canadian Defence Minister, Bill Graham, set foot on the island, which would force a Danish government official to announce that Denmark would issue a letter of protest to Canada. And 3 days after that, the Danish ambassador to Canada published an article in the Ottawa Citizen newspaper regarding the Danish view on the Hans Island issue, which, spoiler alert, was something along the lines of, "It's ours. Stay away." 1 more week passes and the Danes take another step in order to force the Canadians to have a discussion about Hans Island. So they sent the Danish Arctic Ocean Patrol cutter HMS Tulugag from Naval Station Grønnedal to Hans Island to assert Danish sovereignty, which finally made the Canadians reopen the negotiations regarding the future of Hans Island. This news was welcomed by the Danish Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who stated, "It is time to stop the flag war. It has no place in a modern international world. Countries like Denmark and Canada must be able to find a peaceful solution in a case such as this." And I must say he spoke some words of truth here. There must be some sort of solution here, which Canada actually agreed with, so they eventually came to the agreement they would meet in New York City in September of 2005 to resolve the issue. Here, Per Stig Møller would meet his Canadian counterpart, Pierre Pettigrew. Wait, Pettigrew. Where have I heard that name before? I can't think of it. Anyway, these two gentlemen would meet, and should they fail to reach an agreement, both governments had agreed to submit the dispute to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Naturally, September came around and Pierre Pettigrew, I swear I've heard that name before. Anyway, assured us they had come to an agreement on a process to resolve the dispute over the island. Fast forward 7 years or so to 2012 and nothing had happened. There's been no agreement, nothing had changed, and Hans Island was still disputed territory. But then an interesting proposal came about. Why not just split the island? Seems like an interesting idea, and both nations could happily live along with just half of this island. But again, no agreement and nothing changed. Then another 6 years passes and the countries finally announce a joint task force to settle the dispute over Hans Island. Great! So what did they come up with? Well, it's now been 3 years since this announcement and we haven't heard anything from the two countries regarding this issue since then. Which brings us to the present day, where we can ask ourselves 3 important questions. Will this border dispute ever end? It's literally been going on for 90 years now, and since neither of the countries wants to take it by force, it seems likely they won't come to terms anytime soon. But what if they did come to terms? Who would be the most likely to end up with this island? Well, it's hard to say, but many people believe that Denmark should get it, because Vikings were the first to discover the island and conquer it many years ago. And then there's the obvious fact that the island has a Danish name, Hans, or as we would say in Denmark, Hans. But I should say I'm obviously a Dane myself, so take that for what it's worth. Lastly, and probably the most important question that we need to ask, is why do they even want this island? And that's honestly a harder question to answer than who the island belongs to. I mean, it's not really that interesting of an island. It's tiny, at just 1.3 square kilometers in total size, and the makeup of the island is quite boring, since it's made up of nothing but rocks. There are no signs of oil or anything valuable underneath the island, so if you are struggling to find any sign of value or importance, then you're not alone here. The only reason I could come up with for why this island is somewhat important to these nations is that whoever ends up claiming it as their sovereign territory can extend their territorial limit. which isn't even that useful considering the narrow strait is covered in ice most of the year. But maybe it will become useful when the Arctic shipping routes open up due to global warming and when the ice melts, which hopefully is many decades down the line. But it could explain the two countries' lack of desire to resolve this issue now, since it's not useful to them today. But what do you think? I would love to hear some different perspectives on this very interesting border dispute. Otherwise, that's been it for this time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.